Welcome to East Asia Pulse, a podcast series by the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore. I'm Frank Pieke, and I will be your host today. For this episode of the podcast, our guest is Scott Kennedy of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics. Scott is in town for our joint conference on industrial policy. His research and writings on foreign Chinese business relations, Chinese economic policy and economic security provide a voice of sanity in the increasingly shrill debates in the US on the Chinese threat to American leadership and hegemony. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, Scott has called for moderation by the incoming Trump administration in upping the ante on restrictions on China in trade, investment, and science and technology, arguing that this would do perhaps more damage to the US economy and living standards than it would hold China's rise. Welcome, Scott, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Frank. It's great to be here with you.
We are speaking on the 8th of January 2025, just a few weeks ahead of Donald Trump's swearing-in ceremony for his second term in office, now as the 47th President of the United States of America. Arguably more than anywhere else on the planet, with of course the possible exception of Ukraine and Russia, China's leaders and businesses are trying to second-guess what might be in store for their country. As the world's first and second largest economies, the US and China continue to be deeply interconnected and interdependent, despite the efforts of China to become self-reliant and the US agenda to decouple from China in strategic sectors. As both powers are determined to move away from each other, they might actually verge towards a future collision and get thereby closer. This development has by no means fully played itself out, so I would like to begin by exploring possible future steps and their consequences for each country. So, Scott, you recently wrote that China is trying to Trump-proof its economy in a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. So what do you think are the main threats that China sees coming from the new administration, and how is that different from what China already has had to face under Biden and Trump 1?
Frank, as you said, we're in Singapore, and I've traveled 10,600 miles, and I still can't get away from talking about U.S.-China relations and what's going on in D.C., no matter how far I go. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the U.S. and China, which is one of my favorite topics and one we can't get away with. China has always been concerned about its overdependence on the rest of the world and the state of its technology capabilities vis-a-vis others. And it's going back to the Opium War, if not earlier. China has sought some degree of technological independence and to protect its sovereignty, given everything that it has gone through over its history. It's certainly, in the last 2 decades, turned up the dial on the need to try and achieve greater technological independence and self-reliance. And it's now matched by the U.S., which has been pursuing a very similar goal. Both are uber freaked out about losses to sovereignty. And so you've seen the Chinese be worried about dependence on the dollar, technology, all different kinds of things. And the U.S., over the last 6 to 7 years, has moved in the same direction. It's been politely called de-risking, but we know that it's become a lot more than that. With the return of President Trump, there's no perfectly Trump-proofing one's economy simply because of the uncertainty that comes with his administration and what he might do. That's mostly a psychological adaptation that you have to make to be ready for that variability. And quite frankly, when I was in China a couple months ago, talking to the Chinese right after the election, I found them actually relatively calm about what might be coming their way. They knew that Trump had been talking about increasing tariffs to 60%, getting rid of MFN, a whole bunch of other things. And in the weeks since, he's talked about tariffs as a response to Chinese approaches to fentanyl, immigration. So they expect a lot to come their way. I think what they're trying to do are 3 things to be ready. One is develop their own retaliatory responses. And we've seen already them bring forth some increased restrictions with regard to export controls on critical minerals. They've targeted 3. They could target several more. They've launched an investigation into NVIDIA for antitrust violations. They could investigate more companies. There's a whole variety of ways that they could slap back at the U.S. economically as well as diplomatically. I think the other ways that they're really trying to protect themselves is, first of all, strengthening their own domestic economy from whatever external shocks they may face. And so you've seen a great deal of attention in the last couple months, since September, by the Chinese leadership about trying to stimulate the economy, promote domestic demand, address the problems of local governments and their finances. And the pressure from the U.S. is actually probably going to accelerate their efforts to tackle some of these longstanding problems in their economy. The last thing is expanding their partnerships with everyone else around the world. China does not want to be isolated. And so you've seen officials get on lots of airplanes, fly all over the place to meet with folks in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia for diplomatic improvement and try to improve the relationship diplomatically, as well as ink new deals. And in Europe is a place where they've focused heavily on because they are potentially a very important technology partner for them. So there's no way to fully Trump-proof one's economy, but they are moving pretty rapidly to be as prepared as they can be.
Right. So this is actually quite ironic, I think, because as the American government tries to cut China to size, to contain it, even roll it back, the actual outcome might be that China comes out stronger, both because it finally is forced to take its own economic problems really seriously and do something about it, and also by even further stepping up its international reaching out to other countries and trying to forge semi-alliances with countries that are not necessarily fully allied with the United States. So do you think that in the Trump administration or America at large, people are at all aware of this particular irony?
I think that there is now greater awareness of the need to evaluate the effectiveness of American policy and the restrictions they have imposed and what they have yielded, and to the extent that there are outcomes that they didn't expect, that, as I wrote in my foreign affairs piece, things backfiring. I do think, though, when the U.S. in the Biden administration thinks about technological leadership and maintaining technological leadership over China, you can define that idea in a variety of different ways. Technological leadership may be about just being at the cutting edge. It may be about being the dominant producer, commercializer, and diffuser of technologies. It may be about having the best ecosystem and the best universities and things like that. And certainly what the U.S. has done has focused on the first kind of technological leadership, technology at the cutting edge, because that's the most directly related to military preparedness. So advanced semiconductors, AI, quantum, that's where they really tried to slow the Chinese down. But I don't think that there's awareness yet enough of that. My colleague Jeffrey Ding at GW, George Washington University, has just written a great book about different types of technological leadership and the ways in which, ironically, what the U.S. is doing is actually advancing Chinese goals. I don't think Xi Jinping is going to send a thank you card to Washington and say, we really appreciate it. I remember 20 years ago when I was studying anti-dumping cases, one of the funny things that we found in cooperation with colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences is that Chinese industries that were hit with anti-dumping investigations ended up being more productive than those that were not. And so that protectionism actually pushes you to get better. It's not saying that China is now going to be a world technological superpower and dominate over the U.S. because of what the U.S. is doing. But the U.S. could be way smarter in how it's approaching this competition.
You mean using interdependencies rather than trying to undo them? That's basically what you're saying, right?
It's a lot of the interdependencies that the U.S. has with China have actually been to the U.S.'s advantage. You don't recognize them because they come in structural sources of power. Nobody usually spends 2 seconds thinking about whether they should use the U.S. dollar or the renminbi. They just use the U.S. dollar. That is just a commercial reality. But that commercial reality comes with a lot of power that is afforded the United States. It lets it have huge deficits. It allows it to not worry about its exchange rate as much. And the same way with using technologies like Qualcomm's CDMA standard in cell phones and those kinds of things. You want the Chinese being addicted to those kinds of technologies and using them. And yes, in some areas, You really do not, from the Washington, D.C. point of view, want to provide China the technological capabilities to make their missiles more accurate that would harm you. So there are rightful places to impose technology restrictions, whether it's export controls or investment restrictions, et cetera. But if you go too far and you do everything, if you open up your coat and you show everyone all of your weaponry, and then you make all of these things which were normal commercial interactions seem much more politicized, it's driving them away. And I think that's actually undermining American global leadership in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise been the case.
A slightly different question is, today I read about Donald Trump's speech regarding his foreign policy agenda, which scares the living daylights out of me, at least. Annexing Greenland, annexing Canada, annexing Panama. What's next, really? But my question really is, China is a little missing from that list. So is there a possibility that Donald Trump might be so busy doing all these other territorial issues that he'll forget about China? This is an American problem, right? It's been a long-standing American problem that they focus on other things and forget about China, while all this time saying, yes, China is a real issue and we have to deal with it. But they never really do because other things are more urgent. Is that possibility also going to happen under Donald Trump?
I think we have to be ready to differentiate between what is said by the president in speeches and through social media and what the incoming administration actually does. A lot of that verbiage is just thoughts off the top of the head. Mm-hmm. Some of it may be connected to actual real goals, but I really think we ought to focus on what is done rather than what is said. I don't think that the incoming Trump administration has decided that Denmark and Panama need to be the two biggest areas of focus for U.S. foreign policy over the next 4 years. Actually, in both cases, there is a China component. The U.S. needs critical minerals and resources and new sources of energy and shipping routes, which Greenland raises as a possibility. Mm-hmm. Chinese shipping companies dominate a lot of the shipping processing through the Panama Canal. There's a China element to both of these. I don't think when it comes down to it that the U.S. is going to be looking to annex territories or go to war with a European ally or a Latin American country that is extremely important. I think what this does is highlight that these are big issues that need to be resolved. I don't think we should get too alarmed about that. But what we should get alarmed about is tariffs will be raised. Relationships with allies will be worsened. This idea that you must put pressure to gain leverage, to force a negotiation a la the real estate industry, that's occasionally effective in foreign policy, but usually not. And so what we're going to look for is, will the Trump administration have a broader palette of foreign policy tools and tunes than they did the first time around? They had that experience of the first 4 years. When you talk to Trump administration folks from the first term and people during the campaign, they recognize the Biden administration did a great job relative to them on engaging with allies. But that means being a little bit less caustic, a little bit more careful, having ears, not just mouths. We will have to see if they're able to do that. I think they know that. And it makes working in a think tank, being in Washington, important, and for everybody else as well, because the story has not yet been written.
I want to turn back on the outgoing administration and its China policy, sort of an assessment of how effective they have been in achieving their strategic goals. So could you, first of all, say very briefly what you think the Biden administration's strategic goals were vis-a-vis China? And secondly, whether they have been able to achieve these goals. So how effective have they been in doing what they set out to do?
I used to be a professor. I'm not one now. But if I was going to give the Biden administration a grade on its China policy, I'd give them a good B-. And a B- ain't bad in American foreign policy. And that's not a gentleman's B-, it's a real B-. They, I think, decided that the broad goals of their foreign policy was to frame the relationship with China as a contest of different systems and views of the international order, and that China represented a threat to this order because of its domestic politics, its mercantilist economic policies, its aggressive approach towards its neighbors internationally, and in particular because of its growing collaboration with Russia over Ukraine. And I think that framing It certainly rubs a lot of people the wrong way because it sort of sets things up as authoritarians versus democracies. And the U.S. has had to collaborate with some other authoritarian regimes. But as a tool to put China on the defensive, I think it's worked really well. And I think they've spent a great deal of time, particularly on the national security side, shoring up their relationships in Europe and Asia, having some institutional creativity with the Quad and AUKUS, expanding conversations on national security to advance technologies and bringing those different communities together. So I think on the national security side, they've done a pretty darn good job. The biggest problems on the economic side is that they've talked a good game about the Chinese threat to the liberal international order and the rules-based order, but they themselves have been hypocrites and broken the rules themselves and basically decided that WTO is irrelevant and they're going to use industrial policy and restrictions as much as anybody. And they've been very unambitious when it comes to moving forward and collaborating with others. There's nothing like AUKUS and the Quad on the economic side. The IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement, in which some Southeast Asian countries have joined, is really a small shadow of the WTO or even the TPP, and doesn't come with any of the type of market opening benefits that really would make it a serious institution. And so on those scores, I think the administration, the security versus economics, I think it's quite different. I think the other side of this is, again, as we discussed a little bit earlier, the hyper anxiety about interdependence as only a source of vulnerability rather than looking at the potential benefits. And I think that's an intellectual problem. I think it's a political problem that have led them to underappreciate the value of interdependence and how it could be utilized to their advantage. So compared to where the U.S. was in 2020, with basically had relationships with allies totally broken, was really on a fast pace to lead the world toward global fragmentation and potentially conflicts, we're in a better place. It's still quite challenging, and that's not just because of the Biden administration. China has done a lot of dangerous things. I wouldn't give Xi Jinping anywhere near B- for Chinese foreign policy.
So you gave the Biden administration a B-. I would reckon that the current policies that are in store with the Trump administration would probably not amount to a B-, even proactively. But what do you expect will be different, apart from the issue of tariffs, which is very clear? But what else do you expect in the China-US relationships? I'm also thinking about the implications for Chinese Americans. They can be quite severe. In fact, a few days ago, I spoke to a victim of Trump 1's China initiative, a professor at MIT, and he was extremely apprehensive about what might happen again to him and other people in America that happen to be from China and continue to have relationships with Chinese fellow researchers and institutions and also as teachers back in China. So could you say a little bit about what Trump might do beyond the issue of tariffs that everybody talks about?
Sure. I think it depends on the day of the week or whether it's morning and it's sunny out or whether it's cloudy and raining. Sometimes I feel like the sky is falling and U.S. foreign policy and public policy as a whole is going to be an absolute disaster and democracy itself is in danger. Other days of the week, after I've had a little bit of exercise, gotten some sun, I try to look at the other side of things and believe that much more will be said than actually done in terms of these things, whether it's on immigration policy, trade policy, et cetera. Broadly speaking, if you go by what they say, the Trump administration is not trying to defend the West with a capital W. It doesn't believe in the West with a capital W. It doesn't believe in the international order that the U.S. created post-World War II, where market democracies and their rules basically became the standard for how countries interacted with each other. And so you will not see a huge emphasis on democracy and human rights. You will not see a defense of markets, market economies, and the institutions that undergird them, or a defense of allies and the collaboration with them that says, under any circumstances, we got each other's back. We're likely to see something different. You know, it could be that it's entirely unilateralist and a defense of white nationalist approach at home, and then that type of approach internationally. And if it really is that way, then that is going to just lead to massive social tensions domestically And the type of problems that we had, whether it was the China Initiative or others, will seem like small potatoes. Because if you are really imposing massive restrictions on immigration and you're rounding up millions of people and expelling them, it's going to create enormous social tensions and conflict and have disastrous effects on the American economy. If trade policy simply becomes punitive tariffs, one on top of the other against others, that is not thoughtful industrial policy meant to provide protection while you support infant industries and get to the leading edge, et cetera. That is just outright emphasis on protecting what you have, those who have been losers so far, and you want to give them some benefits, but not looking at the future. The American future does not lie in the steel industry. It lies in advanced semiconductors, in advanced services, in IoT, in AI, both in terms of what provides productivity as well, actually is what provides employment. People may not understand. U.S. Steel in Western Pennsylvania only has about 20,000 employees, not hundreds of thousands of employees. And so I'm quite concerned that Trump may be trying to model what American power should look based on how things looked in the year 1900 as opposed in 2025. So I think actually the biggest challenges for the United States, everyone else could face significant challenges. I do think if you just look at it through the narrow lens of U.S.-China, a lot will look similar because there'll be a lot of the similar tools. The Biden administration did not remove any of the tariffs. The Trump administration is not going to stop the technological restrictions. The language about the U.S. and its place in the world, I think we'll still hear a lot of that from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and others. So I think if you just look at this through the lens of that thin slice of U.S.-China relations, things won't look radically different. But the broader context will be fundamentally different. And I think actually that is even more important. You have to raise your eyes above the ground to look at the broader picture. Otherwise, you're going to miss what the bigger story is.
I want to turn now to the issue of the relationship of Trump with Elon Musk and how that sits with his relationship with neocons like Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz. One of the things that I think might be possible is that continued relationships, economic relations, business relationships with China will be less a matter of specific rules or laws or regulations, but more a matter of political influence, political patronage, perhaps even corruption at the individual level on a one-by-one basis. And I think Elon Musk would very much like that. Do you see that as a serious possibility, or you think the American political system will not allow that, as it were?
The U.S. has never practiced industrial policy very effectively because we have a relatively weak state. We also have a penetrated state. We have a lot of lobbying interests, which make that usually not very effective. But because we have a relatively small government relative to society, it's been typically hard for businesses to use the state to just enrich themselves outright. You have to make stuff and be successful. So crony capitalism, we've got crony capitalism with a small c. In the U.S., we've had that for a long time. We'll continue to have it. We may see it slightly turbo boosted under President Trump, given his approach. In terms of Elon Musk, gosh, we've seen a lot of him lately, haven't we? During the campaign, since the campaign. And there's rumors that he's had a role in the selection of officials for various parts of the bureaucracy, including some that are China-related. But we'll have to wait to see unless he decides to tweet about it and tell us what he did. But I'm still not entirely sure that it's going to be these globally connected business people with interest to preserve the relationship versus human rights hawks who see China as the biggest evil empire out there that needs to be tackled. Marco Rubio being the prime example, who tends to see China as sort of a very large Cuba, given his experience. Elon Musk is hard to say because, yes, Tesla, biggest, most important business that he currently has in China with his factory in Shanghai, produces for the China market, also for the global market, exports a lot to Europe, for example. And so that's important for him. He would like to roll out their autonomous vehicle technology in China and needs the Chinese approval to do that. On the other hand, His other businesses have zero market share in China. Starlink, zero market share in China. And the Chinese are direct competitors. They want to put up 15, 20,000 satellites to compete with Starlink. His rocket launching company, direct competitors. Actually, everywhere where the Chinese go, it's a potential competitor with Elon Musk. So it's possible that Elon Musk could decide, you know what, let's turn up the dial on China. Let's whack them. And personality-wise, he's also known to be very high-handed and likes using pressure, and he's a skilled negotiator. So there may be times when that difference is actually not how things look behind the scenes. We just don't know. And also, yes, he's beginning as co-lead of this Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, but nevertheless, he's a person that consumes a lot of oxygen in any room that he's in. So does President Trump. I think there's an over-under of 6 months on how long he lasts. Now, boy, if he makes it a very long time, that would be extremely impressive to watch these two folks with huge egos coexist with each other. We will just have to see. They obviously right now both find the relationship with the other beneficial for themselves, but we will have to see.
Okay. And I want to turn to a slightly different topic, and that is the impact of heightened geopolitical conflict on businesses, both in China and in the US. So US businesses have been decoupling or diversifying from China for several years now, either voluntary or, more likely, involuntary. Would you advise such businesses to revisit their China strategy now? And might that lead to a departure from China across the board by American businesses instead of just in a few strategic sectors?
We are still trying to catch up with the data on what's actually happening. I know that you've done a lot of work on this. Myself, others have been trying to figure out how many American companies are on the ground in China, what's happening with their investment, the amount of employment, their resources. Certainly there have been significant adjustments, and the upward trend that existed for the first 2 decades of the 21st century, that definitely is gone. That's partly as a result of the tariff war from 2018 and 19, which just raised costs for companies in those industries that were hitting by tariffs and wanting to be elsewhere. Then the pandemic and the supply chain risks from being in a place where goods could not move. And then the technology competition and restrictions that have been imposed since. We've tried to quantify where we see significant changes. And certainly in terms of travel of people and students, it's gone down. New investment has gone down. Existing investment hasn't. They have not all left. They've diversified, but they haven't all left. Trade is still very high, but as a percentage of both countries' total trade, the other is not as large a source of a trading partner as they used to be. There's been some attenuation of the relationship, but they're still significantly interdependent. And I think for companies where China is the end market, staying in China makes total sense, or exporting to China still makes total sense, and they ought to stay there until they're kicked out. Because it's gosh damn 1.4 billion consumers and a big government procurement market. And although China is in a very serious rough patch, and this rough patch could extend for quite some time, even a slow-growing China for some companies is a huge opportunity. So if you're not either kicked out by the Chinese or pulled out by the U.S., I expect those companies will want to stay. And if you look at those that are in consumer goods, in retail, in hotels, they're staying, and some of them are actually quietly expanding their business. Those in advanced technologies have to be really worried both by the restrictions Beijing is placing and those by the U.S. And so I think we're seeing in vehicles right now basically a relatively quick and much faster move towards a fragmentation of the global auto market and its supply chain than I would have expected. Originally brought about through tariffs, now through data security rules, which will basically make it almost impossible for Chinese to sell cars in the United States and potentially other Western markets. And U.S. market share and of foreign companies in China has also been going down. We could see that expand to pharmaceuticals and other data-intensive industries. I still think that whether you're in China or diversify or you double down, it really depends on your sector and company by company basis. Some companies, the boss has a mega high tolerance for risk, and they're just willing to just stomach just about anything. They've got an iron stomach. In others, they're just super, super fearful, and just simply the rumor that there could be war in the Taiwan Strait leads them to run. So I don't think there's any one necessary strategy, but certainly If you talk to companies now, China is not their number one place of future growth. It is not the place where they think even in the short term that they're going to make their most money. They're really looking at other markets, but they're not absolutely running away.
When we turn to businesses from other countries, not the US, but say Europe or in our case here in Singapore and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, do you think the situation will be fundamentally different compared to the situation that American companies are facing in China? Are there perhaps more opportunities for them to continue to stay and grow in China, or will they be facing the same constraints? And what do you make of this argument that foreign invested companies in China may have reached a tipping point of harassment, of problems, of geopolitical issues that may incite them to say, enough is enough, we're going to pull out?
Companies from other countries, especially Western allies of the United States, in advanced technology face a lot of the similar kinds of pressures, and in some areas are being discriminated against because the Chinese government is telling Chinese companies, source locally if you can. And in some cases, that actually there's a very high quality domestic alternative now. On the other hand, sometimes the first step is de-Americanize. And when you de-Americanize, you might still choose a foreign alternative, not a local one. And the EU, ASEAN, Taiwan, the UK, they've been using slightly different diplomatic approach towards China. They've been pushing for being careful on the national security front, but trying to follow the law. So the EU's measures on China and electric vehicles, actually, they really went by the book in their anti-subsidy investigation. Very different from the U.S., which just picked a number out of thin air, 100% on certain kinds of tariffs, 50% on others. Just a big number that they thought would stop the trade. And I think that may make a difference. And foreign companies in China may partly benefit if they could gain some American market share. I think the other big area of difference is how the rest of the world treats Chinese investment and Chinese businesses going abroad, generally speaking. So the U.S. has basically put up a not for sale sign, a do not invest sign, and we want to diversify from other sources. The EU has said we are really worried about Chinese subsidizing their industries and exporting that stuff to us. But if they want to invest here, we're happy to take that because then they'll be hiring our workers and sharing their technology with us. And we've also seen the same in Latin America, for example, in Brazil, where BYD took over the Ford factory in Sao Paulo. And so others' relationships with China aren't just going to be about what their businesses are doing on the ground in China. It's going to be about how Chinese companies are going international and whether they take advantage of that. One of the rosy scenarios, the soothing scenarios for U.S.-China relations under Trump is that the two sides cut a deal, and one component of which would be attracting Chinese investment in the U.S. in manufacturing and a bunch of different sectors. I think that's probably unlikely because it's going to run into this national security buzzsaw that we've created. But the other parts of the world are interested in doing that. Again, this is one of those unintended consequences. Yes, you punish the Chinese on the ground in China, but Chinese companies react. And they go around the world and invest, and not everyone's shutting the door. Surprise.
Yeah. Well, an interesting thing about that is also that, at least from my own research, is that these Chinese companies do so quite often very deliberately by also localizing their production and their supply chains, because they're very much afraid that if they don't do that, they may not be allowed to continue, or they may face, of course, American sanctions and American problems because of the American content in their products.
Can I just add one other thing about U.S. firms and this larger issue about decoupling is I think our original vision was you're either going to be connected or we're going to fragment into economic entities that don't interface with each other at all. And I do think that companies are looking for alternative ways to cross that line. One way of which is to take your company and split it into two different entities. So in the case of private equity and venture capital, you're seeing them do so. So
Sequoia, for instance.
Yeah, Sequoia is the example. But you've seen many others do the same. And so that happens in companies where there's partnerships. So you'll see that in law firms as well. In manufacturers, what you will see is a single company create alternative technology platforms. A technology platform, we've got a check mark to operate in the West, in the US, and a check mark that can operate in the Chinese sphere. But it will be the same overall corporate ownership at the top. So VW will have a platform for China, and it will have an alternative platform for everywhere else.
Right.
So decoupling doesn't mean absolutely no interface across. Now, if we get war, then all this stuff goes away and it's looking very different. But in a world of heightened geostrategic tensions, you actually can have global companies operate globally using a whole variety of different kinds of mechanisms. Very costly, time-consuming, really bad for small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have lots of lawyers and accountants. But nevertheless, it won't be absolutely, totally different spaces.
Yes. My point is also that Chinese companies are doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
And that makes it so interesting.
Yes.
I mean, I've talked to Chinese companies in Europe and also here in Singapore, and that's very much on their radar screen. In order to continue to expand globally, which they must now, they have to localize as well.
And of course, we are just 11 days out from TikTok being supposed to make the same kind of adjustments in its business structure if it wants to continue to operate in the United States.
Very good example.
And so it's a very good example of what we may see replicated across lots of different companies.
Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope you'll enjoy the conference, obviously, and I hope to be able to speak to you in the future soon.
Thank you, Frank. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully I can reciprocate at some point and have you on our podcast at CSIS.
I would love to do that. With that, I would like to thank you, Scott, for joining us. Once again, I'm Frank Pieke of the East Asian Institute in Singapore, and you've been listening to East Asia Pulse. To learn more about our work and stay connected, you can subscribe to the EAI's mailing list on our website or follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for listening to us, and until the next time, goodbye.